And good evening. Thank you very much for coming, and I'm very thrilled to be in Dallas, and thank you very much for the World Affairs Council and the Kroll Collection. I'm here, and first of all, to talk about my book, The Lake with No Name. And I think it's only fair that we go back to Tiananmen as the 20th anniversary just upon us, and not only to look at what happened. Clearly, my book was the memoir of that time, but also perhaps we can spend some time and to look at what has happened since, and maybe have some time to debate the legacy of Tiananmen, if there's any, and to look at China and its development in the future. As in that lovely introduction, and Jim had said that I grew up in a labor camp with my parents, and I was sent there, I think mostly because my parents were sent there by Mao and to be re-educated because they were intellectuals. And that was a term used in the Cultural Revolution for anyone who's had, for example, a college degree. I spent about 3 years in the remote mountain region of Sichuan province with my parents, and under very atrocious living conditions. Afterwards, I went back to Beijing. My mother took my sister and I back to Beijing, while my father had to go back to Shanghai, where he was born and where he grew up. Because in China, we had a hukou system. That meant a permission that you have from the government to live in a place. And normally one has to live and work in the place one is born. So my father, although had gone to university in Beijing, met my mother there and got married, had children, and he was not allowed to live in Beijing. It took him 12 years to gain permission from the government to move to Beijing and to live with us. And after that 12 years had passed, luckily, Mao Zedong died. He died in 1976. After he died, Deng Xiaoping came to power, who wisely reinstated universities. Universities were closed in the Cultural Revolution that began in 1966 for 10 years, because Mao had deemed university higher education being unnecessary and anti-revolutionary. So the youth of China was sent to farms, to people's communes to be taught by peasants and learn to be farmhands. And after universities were reinstated, the educational system went back into its normal operational mode. So I was able to go to Peking University in the 1980s. And during that time, I was very fortunate to have met a lot of people who were highly involved in the student democracy movement. And before 1989, China had gone through 2 periods, which you might not be aware of. And in the early 1980s, China had gone through a relatively liberating period of time, and from 1980 to 1986. And there was a rapid economic development in the very first stage, and the brand sort of open door policy that was introduced by Deng Xiaoping. And at that same time, there was also political liberation. The students were able to debate certain ideas that we found fascinating and novel, that we were able to read from newly translated foreign and Western literatures, and these ideas included democracy, liberty, and freedom. But in 1986, the chairman of the Communist Party, by the name of Hu Yaobang, who was sympathetic to the students' debate and democracy movement at that level, was stripped of his position and put under house arrest. And when that happened, China came into a relatively repressive period when all the debate had to go underground, and which caused a lot of tension, and that built up till the 1989, spring of 1989, when Hu Yaobang unexpectedly died of a heart attack. And that, as you all remember, was the event that triggered Tiananmen Square demonstrations. And the students wanted to go out to the street and demanded that they would be allowed to his funeral to say goodbye to someone who was sympathetic to the students. When that demand was refused, the students took to the streets and it developed into a massive demonstration. And I was at Peking University at the time. I took part in the movement with lots of my friends, who some of them became very prominent in the movement and became student leaders and led hunger strikes, for example, and throughout the 7.5 weeks of the Tiananmen movement. When June 4th came, the tanks rode into Beijing and the army opened fire on the students. The movement was crushed. And after that, Beijing came under martial law and the university campuses were sealed off. And there was a lot of arrests. There were executions. And it became a very dangerous place. And I had, before the Tiananmen event, earned a scholarship from the US to continue my graduate studies. So I was able to get my passport after I had been in hiding in the countryside for about a week. And once I had received my passport, I got my visa from the US consulate and left China on 2nd of August and to America. And I remember clearly, and still today, when I arrived in Williamsburg and I stood on the campus of William Mary, it was very quiet. It was an amazing and liberating feeling, and to be standing in a place where I realized for the first time in my life that no one was watching me and no one was going to report the things that I said. If I could, I would very much like at this time to read a very small passage from my book, and then I'd be happy to open up to the floor to answer your questions. And Lake with No Name, I had decided to begin the book with actually returning to China. When I left China in 1989, I remember walking through the gate at Beijing Capital Airport and turning back to look at my parents for, I thought, probably the last time. I had said to myself that I would never return to this country. Unfortunately, or fortunately for me, 7 years later, I did return. I was then the professor at business school in University of Minnesota. I was invited to teach the first MBA students in Beijing. And when I returned to Beijing, and I realized, and I was absolutely shocked at how much the city had transformed. I was sitting in the taxi with my parents. I didn't realize we were actually close to home because I couldn't recognize any of the streets. The streets that I had remembered had disappeared, and they've been replaced by high-rises and highways and flyovers. And I have since returned back to China every year. And every time I go, I'm amazed at how much China changed and how much it improves. And it gives me sometimes a very nostalgic feeling. And when I go to Tiananmen, I see only tourists, and I see happy faces, people, young people who have not a single idea of what had happened there 20 years ago. And at other times, I feel absolute joy that the Chinese people are now living in prosperity, wealth, and happy, very happy lives. And they stroll along Tiananmen Square with their children, with grandparents. I think in some ways that was the vision that we wanted 20 years ago. So this passage that I'd like to read is from that first time that I returned to China in 1996.